Well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us today on this first edition of Aztec On Air in 2016. Um, this is my opportunity to remind those who are not familiar with Aztec On Air that this is an occasion for us to bring renowned experts in a certain field directly into the science centers so that the professionals of our field may be inspired in their work by things that they may be not very familiar with. Although today we are as close as it gets with the topic, which is citizen science, and I know for sure that many of our members and professionals in our field are considering or are already participating in citizen science project or are considering it. And we have, as usual, an expert with us who is a significant person in that field. You know, citizen science is very hot today, and Caren Cooper is certainly one of these persons who made it that way, and one of the leading voices and actors of citizen science. So, Caren, thanks for being with us today from North Carolina. I see you in your office there, in your lab. But you know, can you tell us to start with a little bit about you and how you ended up in citizen science, because that was not the start of your career, right?
Right, right. Well, first, thanks a lot for having me in this conversation today. Yeah, I mean, for me, my career started out, becoming an ecologist, right, studying wildlife, and that interest for me started when I was really young. And when I was a teenager, I started doing field work. And really throughout my 20s, it was just always all about doing field work and studying wildlife. And but then when right before the last field season of my PhD, I started a family. And fieldwork suddenly became really hard too. Anyway, and so right as I finished my PhD, there was an opportunity at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And what they were seeking, they were really building their capacity of researchers who were willing to use data that were collected by bird watchers across the country, because they had amassed these really amazing data sets from citizen science. Anyway, so I jumped at the chance and thought it was fantastic. Anyway, and then so I guess in the beginning I sort of did have this idea of like, oh yeah, I'll let the volunteers all do the work, the fun field work.
Easy, right?
I'll stay home now. But anyway, but as I began to get more and more familiar with the field of citizen science and working with people there, like Rick Bonney, who coined the term, and learning about sort of the whole suite of other outcomes, the scientific outcomes and the social outcomes, I just became more interested in it. So I guess to speak to your question about just how I became more of an advocate for citizen science was.
But Caren, so to be clear, you discovered the field of citizen science actually by being a scientist in need for help. But is that the definition of citizen science, or is there another one?
Yeah, that's not the definition. Yeah, there's a lot of definitions, and a lot of people do define it based on sort of narrowly as it's volunteers collecting and submitting data and sharing it with scientists for scientists' research agendas. That's sort of the Oxford English Dictionary definition, which it was exciting when citizen science made it into the Oxford English Dictionary. But I think for most of us, the term is a little broader than that. And it's really, because there's just this whole enormous suite of ways that the public, non-scientists, can engage in scientific research. And so when I use citizen science, I mean it as a big umbrella term in terms of what it can mean, in terms of the many different ways.
Mm-hmm. And is that also related to the evolution of the citizen science itself? So we know, and that the reference point is always like the Christmas bird counting from Audubon Society, and today we are quite far from that. So there is sort of an evolution. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how your understanding of citizen science has changed over time?
Well, I guess, well, my understanding of it, yeah, it has changed, just mostly because, for one, I came to realize how old it was even before the Christmas bird count. But how long it went without a name, for one thing, and also how long it went, well, the fact that there is actually a lot of different names. So it was happening in a lot of different fields under different names, whether it was community-based participatory research or more newly, with crowdsourcing, it's been called, or just, even do-it-yourself science, a lot of community mapping, a lot of things in public health. So there's been a lot of different terms for it and a lot of different ways that it's looked throughout, forever, really. And I think, anyway, but it has often, like I said, it has often focused on these aspects of data collection, but it can go so much further than that. I mean, like for example, the science shops, which are common in Europe, which are really exchanges of information where people learn about science and scientists learn people's perspective on it.
And we will certainly come back to that during our conversation. But at this point, starting from the definition and the evolution that yourself have known about citizen science, you have data collection, but there is a way of doing that in a very, very simple way by making notes in a book using a protocol. But then also what is significant today, I think, is that the newest technologies are involved in that as well. And so can you tell us a little bit about the most advanced citizen science project that you know about that use these kind of technologies?
Yeah, well, it can really vary. I mean, the technologies can be, things, like GPS units that help, or any other standardized sort of equipment that can help people collect data and report on it. I mean, the internet, cell phones, all those things are totally useful obviously for citizen science. There's advances in human and computer, like in machine learning and human-computer interactions, and and basically in networked science of just the more minds, the more computers working together, the more minds working together, the things that we can accomplish, even with challenging mental tasks, I think is fascinating. Like in biochemistry, with projects like Foldit, which is like where people figure out how proteins fold in a three-dimensional way. I mean, what we're seeing is groups of people can have a higher collective intelligence, for example, than individuals. So there's just a lot of different ways that people working together, and a lot of times technology is mediating those interactions. Or even helping drive computer algorithms and train computer algorithms based on what people can figure out. I'm not sure exactly how to describe that, but that's one of the frontiers. But there's other, basic technologies too, or things that people make, right? Like where the maker movement intersects with citizen science and people building their own environmental sensors,
right,
or things like that. There's
as far interviews that I have read from you before. In preparation of this conversation, you mentioned the use of cell phones in Africa in particular. Can you say a word about that? Why is it so important?
Well, I think Vera was probably referring to Cyber Tracker, which is a mobile device with a GPS unit on it, and it's used by communities that don't have written words, right? So they're non-literate, and it has symbols on it. So that they can still, record data, and it's used in a lot of different contexts. But a lot of times, it's really a tool that empowers communities and gives them a voice that they wouldn't have otherwise, in terms of natural resource management. So, for instance, they can start to record the locations of resources, whether it's special sacred trees or springs or wildlife areas that are important to them, and have that be noted in different types of management plans, for example.
Yeah, that looks like a great opportunity for the use of technology for the survival of some communities that really need this kind of support, right?
And I think it helps too that some of these technologies help with data quality issues in citizen science, because for some citizen science, take my word for it or whatever isn't going to cut it, and people want to see more. And people want to see a geo-referenced, time-stamped, photograph, that validates something.
Absolutely. So, what would you say? And still in the phase of the evolution of citizen science and our understanding about it, or definition of it, or whatever, of adding things to it. Is there anything that is coming up in the citizen science that you did not expect? That you say, oh, really? I would never thought that we would go into that direction.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of areas that have surprised me, I guess. I mean, I didn't expect to see it. Really, in like almost every discipline that I have looked in has some citizen science. I mean, just because my background as an ecologist and in the field with natural resources, and working with people who are hobbyists, who are natural historians, like I kind of thought of that as the realm of citizen science, and then I knew it was in astronomy. But then to see that there's communities that have an interest in so many different fields was a surprise to me, and that different fields approach it different ways. And then there's certain frontiers too that surprised me, like that are sort of on the edge, I guess, like in e-governance or e-planning with smart cities, with green buildings, even with the quantified self, areas where people really want to track and record information, sometimes in very automated ways, but and use that information like directly to make decisions, to inform decision making. So, it's different and it's faster oftentimes than this process that we see like in some scientific research, where there's the aim of it is for a scientific paper and to build knowledge that way, as opposed to this more immediate use.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I would come back at later in the conversation, but clearly one of the points that you make is that citizen science can be a tool to serve your community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about citizen science. I mean, a lot of times, let's see how to say it. I mean, there's a couple of things with it, right? So citizen science, it's like science in that it can create new knowledge that we couldn't really have attained otherwise, because so many minds and so many people are involved. But it does more than that, because then it also creates a whole bunch of social outcomes like social capital, science learning, empowered communities, all these different other things that can happen from citizen science. And so I think if we only talk about citizen science as sort of how can people help science, that's really only half the equation. And the other half is how can science serve people? I think when people are engaged in it in more ways, it's more likely that science will be more valued and sort of in service.
So more than a direct result for the research, it's a public engagement type of activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than a public engagement activity, though. I think it's science is this tool to make new knowledge, which can inform so much of what we do. And it's a tool also to how we experience the world and how we come to understand and have like a shared understanding of the world, in this very validated, set process. And I think having the public have access to that, as opposed to just the people who are trained as professionals in it, having more and more people have access to that system can really transform a lot of things.
And I really agree with you on that. I'm just going to challenge you a little bit on this, and that is, if we speak about citizen science, a scientific process, and in the way that you speak about the citizen science, you are quite confident that people are getting familiar with the science methodology and the scientific process. And I'm not sure that is always the case. So how can you make sure that when people are involved in that they get a better understanding of how science works? Because that's then also the basis for me to use the results as a tool for decision making in your community. Otherwise, it really doesn't. It's more advocacy than anything else.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And it's not like every single person who has engaged in citizen science has come to the same understanding of science. But we have seen studies that have shown that people can gain new perspectives and attitudes and understanding of science and how it works and the relevance that it has in their lives. And I think that a lot of the field, I mean, citizen science itself, it's not just this practice that we do, but it's also a discipline of people studying exactly these questions. How can we best design it so that it achieves those kinds of results? How can we design it so that we get the research results we want in terms of our, our scientific questions? How can we design it so that we get these social outcomes that we want? And that's a huge area, rapidly growing body of research. That's why the Citizen Science Association, formed in a lot of ways to bring practitioners together to share on that idea of best practices. And that's why we formed the journal, Citizen Science Theory and Practice, as a scholarly way to share research, about scholarly approaches to studying that question.
That looks like a great initiative, and I have seen it, and I hope that people get interested in that journal and that it gets a large dissemination. It's really worth it. But then, speaking about the method, we also have to speak then about the quality of the results. So how can you make sure that the data that is collected with so many people that often are alone in the collecting of this data end up to be valid? Because what's happening.
It's funny whenever I speak about citizen science, that's usually the first question I get from the audience is how can the data be good enough? And that happens after I've spent like an entire seminar reviewing all the scientific findings from citizen science. So I usually say, well, the proof is in the pudding. I've just shown you, there's, so many things that we know from citizen science. But, even still, every project has its own way of dealing with data quality. There's projects, that will, go extra lengths to train participants, to develop their skills and to test them. There's projects that will have sort of expert verification, which are sometimes just expert volunteers, right? People who are just really known to be great natural historians or great birders or whatever. There's projects that have ways of statistically identifying biases, bias in the data and correcting for it. There's a lot of projects that actually will, in their first phase, will test data collected by participants against data collected by professionals and make sure, that it is valid. There's projects, a lot of online crowdsourcing that'll use consensus tools, right? So just, if enough people identify a photograph the same way, then we can find it reliable. So I'm just saying there's a whole suite of ways that projects deal. There's not just one answer. There's the whole suite of ways that data quality is dealt with. And you could say the same for regular science, right? I mean, when I, was an intern on projects doing bird surveys, people would compare the inter-observer reliability. They'd compare my observations to the other interns' observations because there was always differences and ways to account for it. Anyway.
But there's something particular here, and that is that if you get people on board and they have to train and they have to spend some of their time to get trained and do that work and collect this data, at some point they have to see that it means something. Otherwise they won't continue to do it, right? So the first thing for the scientists is to make sure that the data that they collect through that is valid so that they can use it in their research. And on the other hand, they must make sure also that they continue the dialogue with the people who collect, because otherwise they feel used, right? Just to collect data, and that's not what they want, I suppose.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that is considered best practices in citizen science, is that people are treated more as collaborators who stay in the loop, but it's also can be a challenge in terms of providing those data back in a visual way or in an accessible way for people to understand and to learn about what they mean, to make meaning from it. It's funny though, I mean, it is best practices, but there's definitely projects that have persisted for years. Well, like for example, the Nest record cards started in the 60s and it eventually morphed into the Birdhouse Network and now NestWatch. But people contributed a lot to the Nest record cards, and even before we had sort of these practices of reporting back to the participants. I mean, there was an element of trust there that they're going to get used, and and no one even knew how they were going to be used then. No one knew that those cards would be used to understand how birds respond to climate change, but
Mm-hmm.
that's what they were used for. But nobody set out to do that in the beginning. So there's definitely that element of it, which is very much relates to museum philosophies about making observations or collecting specimens or whatever, and having that for a legacy, because who knows how it might be useful in the future.
So let me step a little bit aside of that now, because I have the feeling that using the results of data for the community, using that for decision making, for the for improving your community looks like a right thing to do. On the other hand, we see a multiplication of what we now call environmental monitoring. In how far is that scientifically based, and in how far can the monitoring be considered as a citizen science project, or rather an advocacy tool? So under which circumstances are they acceptable as citizen science project that influence their community?
I mean, yeah, I can't. I guess I'd ask, what's an example of where it wouldn't be citizen science? I mean, if people are collecting data in a rigorous way, and using that information, even if they're using it, to make a case to protect their air or their water, I still would call that citizen science. I mean, the science part is not the advocacy part. The science part is collecting the valid information.
Mm-hmm.
But
so you would just say that if the data is collected correctly, with a good protocol of collecting, it is good enough to serve as a tool for decision.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Why wouldn't it be?
Oh, no, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying to understand your position. I'm saying this is coming up a lot now.
It is coming up a lot, and yeah, there's been, like, for example, there was an editorial in Science about it that I didn't agree with, that called into question, whether these were things that we should try, whether these were troublesome spots in citizen science. Where to me it was like, that's the broader impacts of citizen science, the fact that communities have this tool that of course they should have access to. I mean, and to say that there's these worries about bias, it's like, well, I mean, corporations have access to they use science too. Are we not going to pretend that they might have a bias?
Yeah.
So I think yeah, I think that it's a
that's fine. I think that's very valid as a position, and I think I'm standing behind you on this. So I think we can make that point that it is to be considered.
Yeah, so, and I think it's up to. I think actually it'd be great to provide more infrastructure and tools and mentoring and all kinds of things to actually support those kinds of. efforts.
And this tells them a little bit, by extension, also about how the scientific community actually responds to that movement, because we can see very easily why scientists are interested in having more data and having it in a way that it's done so that it's valid and that it makes something, and even that it goes in some certain circumstances to become tools for decision making based on their research. I can see that. Does the scientists also see that it may change the way that they do science? The new dimensions of citizen science, the public engagement part of it, the decision-making part of it, should, I think, change the way scientists look at their own practice. And I'm not sure if that is happening. And I'm going to quote Chris Filardi here, and he was one of the keynotes at the first Citizen Science Conference. You may probably, and he says that the history of citizen science suggests we can do more in a variety of contexts, broadening the process of how scientific questions are framed and expanding who is involved in the framing is transforming how we do science. And I think that's an important statement, and that relates very much to a vision about science that is not very US-like. It's more happening outside of the US in what we call upstream engagement. And how do you think it's happening here in the US? Do the scientific community understand that you can ask for more citizen science to support your work, but that means something to change your own view about the scientific process as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that more and more scientists are seeing that, ones who are engaging. Often, you know, it's not why they start. Like you said, they start because they have either they want or need more data, or they have a data deluge. You know, they have too much data because information is, there's so much, you know, whether it's, you know, DNA or that needs processing or whatever. But yeah, then people do, I think scientists do tend to come to see some differences or some ways that they can carry out science differently. Well, like here at NC State, there's a new, they call it public science. So they have this term, public science, kind of, and Rob Dunn, who ran the citizen science programs called Your Wildlife, he coined that term. And it kind of refers to sort of all the different ways that scientists can carry out their research in a more, that it is engaging the public. So like it involves citizen science, it involves science communication, it involves just open science practices, right, which are being adopted by more and more scientists now. I don't know if you know what I mean by open science, but of sharing data, of sharing, you know, of having open access publications, of being fully transparent in all stages of the work, right, and not thinking of your data as your data, but thinking of it as a public good, that it's data and everyone can use it. So I think those intersections of open science and science communication, and I mean not with a deficit approach, you know, perspective, but science communication in terms of a two-way dialogue.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the purpose of a two-way dialogue is that both sides are learning. So that right there says scientists are learning from the public too, you know, and doing citizen science in, you know, whatever form, whether it's a contributory style or whether it's a community-based approach. Yeah, I think those. I think there's going to be more and more scientists that want to adopt those approaches, and I think also that we'll see the demographics of scientists change a bit too because of it. Because I think some of the studies that have been done on why there's fewer underserved minorities in STEM careers has pointed to the fact that that what they want to do is more publicly engaged and more publicly relevant types of work. And I think if we can make citizen science and this kind of public science that way, then it'll be of interest to a broader spectrum of society.
That's very interesting, and I hope at some point we can continue that conversation maybe in your journal or in the conference. But I think it's a dimension that is really interesting, and I thank you for mentioning that. You yourself, you are developing your project in the frame of the museum right now in North Carolina. Can you tell us a little bit about how that looks? What is particular to the fact that you are in a way working with the museum?
Yeah, well, I love it here. I've been here a year now, and so I have, well, for example, one citizen science project that I've started piloting was related to house sparrows, which are non-native in the U.S. And a lot of people who are bluebird monitors tend to, if they find house sparrow eggs, they've been throwing them away. And so here I am, you know, in the museum now with these collections, right? It's a museum in the sense that there's this public, it's a public space for people to come and learn and experience science, but then there's also actual collections, right, of specimens that researchers come and use and whatnot. Anyway, so now I have a citizen science project where people are collectors and they can send house sparrow eggs to me that we curate, and people can watch us do it because my lab is behind glass. People can watch us curate these eggs and have them in our museum collection, and they can support a whole variety of research. Partly because eggs, I mean, one of the things I'm looking at is eggs as a, because they bioaccumulate a lot of contaminants, so they could be useful for communities for biomonitoring. But anyway, but what I've really learned from that is that museums have tons of resources that are useful for citizen science, including the data infrastructure that museum collections have, right? Because they're used to having data collected that is kept and shared, like in perpetuity, right? So for these legacies, for having collections that are long-lasting. I mean, it's what museums have always been about. So the data infrastructure is really awesome, and the staff here that understands science and understands informal science education and experiential learning. And I think well, museums too, I think surveys have shown, are this really trusted place. It's what the public trusts museums more than any other source for scientific information.
I can confirm
that. And then to be able to offer people access to science through citizen science, I think that's just huge to be able to do that and to reach an even broader audience than any particular hobby group. And then the other thing the museum has been great about too is for pilot testing new protocols, right? Because whenever we design a citizen science project, the field methods basically of what we're asking people to do, like if it's a contributory project, we need to test them, that they make sense, that they work in the field, test them with participants. And well, here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, we have the Prairie Ridge Eco Station, and a lot of projects, actually, not just our own, will run pilot tests of citizen science projects there. Oh, and they also offer trainings, and so also a lot of citizen science projects can have in-person training at museums, and that's really exciting because a lot of
that is great to hear, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity. As far as I understand, doing it in a museum with collections has a lot of advantages. We are more a field of science centers, and I think a lot of interest there. But is any of what you just said just transferable to a science center? Or what would be the strengths for a science center to do or the weaknesses of a science center to do something like that?
Well, I think the key is that a science center would really need to partner with researchers. And like here, we have this partnership between the museum and NC State and other universities. So there's these university-museum partnerships, and I think the same could happen with any kind of science center. It just is really, it's just such an ideal match, right? Especially when it comes to citizen science. But once you have that, I mean, in terms of, like I said, I mean, these testing of protocols, of training people in protocols, the Denver Museum has a great project where they have in the genetics of taste, where they have volunteers who commit for a year who actually learn stuff in the lab in terms of genetic analyses. But then they're also the ones that deal with visitors who provide samples, of swabs of their tongue. And they've learned that the visitors actually learn best from the volunteers, right, instead of from the scientists. I mean, the communication is just there. So anyway, there's a lot of new models, I'm saying, that have developed for carrying out citizen science in museums and science centers. If they can have these, I think it's best with these partnerships with researchers.
Caren, I'm afraid we are all over time already, and so I'm afraid we are going to have to stop it. But I stop it on a very positive tone here, and very hopeful and interesting new track for science centers to engage with the citizen science type of projects, and I'm a big fan of it. I think many are, and so I hope that this has been able to contribute a little bit to getting more people on board with that, and then more science centers will engage in citizen science projects. I wish you all the best with your journal and with the Association of Citizen Science, and I thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thank you.